Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a new episode of Becoming the Product. Today, I am honored to be in the presence of Josef Mahoney. I had the pleasure of encountering Joseph's work during a seminar at the New Research Center entitled Marxism with Chinese Characteristics, and I was very impressed and intrigued by the content of this class and how political ideology frames technological understandings. As Becoming the Product is a podcast that looks critically at technology and digital culture from a mostly Western perspective, I thought it would be a great idea to introduce your insights and knowledge on the following topic: Made in China, the possibilities of green technology. In recent years, media and online discourse have increasingly started to frame our contemporary era as the quote-unquote Chinese century. Whether driven by shifting economic realities or by a growing soft power the West only faintly perceives, this moment coincides with a redefinition of Made in China. Yet, China faces a central paradox. Its global competitiveness still depends on the low-cost, large-scale manufacturing that also generates the bulk of its carbon emissions. At the same time, China is building a strong reputation for innovation in advanced technologies, particularly AI and automation. This dual trajectory highlights a complex balancing act between sustaining industrial output and pursuing technological sophistication. It also raises critical questions about the social consequence of modernization, including workforce displacement, income inequality, and regional disparities. How do these forces align or collide? Can the Chinese Communist Party position the nation as a leader in clean technology and sustainable production without undermining economic vitality or employment stability? And in the push for clean tech and automation, what becomes of manufacturing workers and low-skilled jobs? Such questions frame an urgent debate over the future of China's economic model and the ethical and environmental dimension of rapid technological change. So, Josef, thanks for being here with me today. It would be great if you could briefly introduce yourself, and then we can move into the questions. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thanks for having me. As you noted, my name is Josef Mahoney. I'm professor of politics and international relations at East China Normal University in Shanghai, where I direct the International Graduate Program in Politics, as well as the Center for Ecological Civilization, and where I'm also the Associate Dean for the Institute for Singularity Studies, or Singularity Politics, I think is the correct English translation. My focus is primarily on Chinese politics, Chinese political systems, also green transformations. This is a more recent development in my research and advocacy. I first came to China in 1998. I was bought out, blacklisted, and have been living in exile since 2010 from my last university job in the United States. So I've been at ECNU for the past 15 years. I also served for a while as a senior research fellow with the leading think tank of the Central Committee, and I'm still serving in various think tank roles in various institutions in China today. So, but I think maybe as we get started, it might be good for me to give some overview of how I understand China's development as a technology power, and that may provide sort of a framework for discussing the specific questions that you raise.
Sure.
So one of the things that I did a few years ago is I published a paper where I went back and I analyzed China's modern development, its historical development, using a Marxist method, looking at that history from the perspective of dialectical and historical materialism. And what I came up with was a point of view that is, I think, regarded by some as being a little heterodox, certainly out of step with the official histories that we get from the CPC, and likewise what we generally hear from Western scholars. But using this Marxist approach, one of the things I did was I went back to the early 1800s, and especially the mid 1800s with 1840 and the Opium Wars. And this is generally when we start to date China's difficult conflict with the West, which will then grow to include Japan. And so, from a Marxist position, what I assessed is that China's vulnerability was primarily due to its relative backwardness as a technological society, and that this is something that would then bedevil it for the next 100 years, what we sometimes refer to as the century of humiliation, which would lead to further conflicts with Europe, concessions, European powers establishing a semi-colonial position in China, and then ultimately the invasion by Japan, which had modernized itself largely in tune with the Western model. Um, and that this would not be resolved until the defeat of the Japanese in 1945. And so one of the things that I argue is that in order to solve what we sometimes refer to as the crisis of Chinese modernity, that the primary contradiction, and this is using the Chinese Marxist concept that was originated by Mao Zedong, that in order to resolve the contradiction that left China vulnerable to foreign aggression, it had to establish itself as as an advanced technological society. And so I then illustrate how the CPC, the Communist Party of China, begins to do this first as a political party itself, how it has to learn how to change itself and save itself in the early difficult 15 to 20 years of its existence, and then to lead that technological transformation of the rest of China up to the present day in order to continue to close that technology gap in ways that would sustain Chinese sovereignty and security. And that precisely as China has begun to achieve significant breakthroughs and increasing parity with the United States, this is when we see the United States pivoting to again try to dramatically widen the technology gap by imposing technology blockades on China and restricting market access to Chinese technological products, and not just technology in the chipset or handset domain, but also Chinese development of green technology. We see, for example, in the new United States security strategy that the U.S. aims to establish itself as an energy superpower, principally on the back of oil, with the United States now the world's largest producer of oil. And of course, there's a close relationship between that and the dollar and U.S. hegemony in the global financial system. So this is the situation that we find ourselves in today. I can back up just a little bit and say that China, without going through the extensive history of all the ups and downs of how China has tried to manage this contradiction, this gap, this technology gap, since the establishment of the PRC in 1949. I would go back to one important date in particular, back in 1999, when there were three things that the United States did that created very serious problems for the Chinese leadership, and which led them to begin to. And it's just one example of something that they did, where they began to develop an existing class of weapons referred to as the assassin's mace. And this class of weapons was designed to seek asymmetric opportunities for So whereas China might struggle to immediately catch up and create parity in absolute terms in military technologies, it could at least seek opportunities where it could exploit asymmetric circumstances. So, for example, China invested heavily and successfully in developing a new class of missiles that we, in the vernacular, refer to as carrier killer missiles, and also created something that we refer to as ghost radar. And both of these are systems that are designed to frustrate the way the United States would initiate a military attack. And they have been largely successful in terms of forcing the United States to develop new strategies and new tactics in terms of its efforts to contain and control China. So my point is that this is not that this is an old problem. This technology issue is an old problem. It's always been directly in the mind of the Chinese leadership, and through time they have consistently not only taken steps to close that gap, but have now, in my estimation, become the world's leading advanced technological society. And what I mean by that is not that China has established itself in first place in all of the basic sciences, or even in all of the various technological products, although it is in first place in some areas and has near parity in others, and only a little behind in others. But nevertheless, the way the Chinese political system, its industries, its people all work together to resolve major crises. This is what's demonstrating its superiority as an advanced technological society. So in this case, we could look, for example, at how China responded to COVID. I used to be a public health officer with the U.S. Centers for Disease Control in the 1990s. I can tell you that what China was able to accomplish in terms of their response to COVID was unparalleled. No other society was able to accomplish what they did in terms of mitigating risks, saving people, and indeed restarting the world's most advanced industrial system to provide the world with the products it needed to help survive the conflict. So that would be one example, but we could also point to AI and AI adoption. So in some respects, the U.S. is leading in AI, but in terms of AI adoption and the way that we're seeing the realization of new efficiencies with AI, improved digital governance and other things, that these types of social and economic benefits are accelerating in China, far outpacing what we've seen in other countries, especially Europe, but also even the United States. So, so in that context, when I look at the U.S. trying to limit China or to turn back the clock technologically, I think it's it's too late in a sense. And from what I can see, China is rather confident that if need be, it can go it alone. Certainly, it doesn't want to do that. And although you might have tech giants in the United States who are, promoting protectionism in order to avoid having to face China in the global marketplace now or down the road. I think this is a short-term strategy that will ultimately fail to realize any sort of substantial knockback. So that's where we are, sort of in terms of the big picture from the way I see things. And if you'd like, we can now move on to you can follow that up with whatever questions you like, or move directly to the questions you've prepared.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think this is actually very helpful to contextualize this for the listeners who might not have access to previous knowledge or courses on the state of things of history of China or the relationship between China and its technological development. So thanks for doing this. As China moves from being perceived as a low-cost manufacturer to a technological innovator, what does this rebranding, quote unquote, reveal about the country's pursuit of technological sovereignty? And is rebranding even a good term in that context? Or is it only about the Western's new perspective on their technological advancement and strategies?
Well, when I hear this question, the first thing is I think rebranding is kind of a curious word, but I think one of the things that happens to you as you get older is you don't become too sensitive to semantics if you want to really get past and get on to some of the larger issues of the discussion. I don't think we generally think of it as a rebranding in China. I don't know that this term is being used um, in the West to describe what's happening here. But I do think that China or Chinese firms, we might say, have been rather successful in changing international perceptions about Chinese technology. I think we can see this. There's, I think, probably it's been well established that internationally, even in developed countries, there's a significant, if not begrudging, respect for China's innovation and development in the green areas in green power and green products. There's an understanding that China has moved forward in dramatic ways, outpacing most other countries in the world in green transformations. And so this is something that is, of course, still in conflict um, with other narratives about China. For example, China is still holding the position as the world's leading producer of emissions. It's not the world's number one per capita per emissions. That would be the United States. And indeed, a lot of the emissions that China produces are by producing products for other people in the world who would rather have their products produced in China and pollution emitted in China than in their own countries. So this is certainly one thing, and another thing, of course, is that in China we do have a tension um, that we have struggled with, but we struggled with in a productive way, in a managed way of green transformations where I can give you, for example, not this most recent summer, but the summer before, local leaders were accelerating green transformations um, faster than um, capacity allowed, and then we had some extreme weather, which tested the limits of the green energy reserves, and then they didn't have enough coal on hand to because you have to place coal purchases in advance. They don't just show up tomorrow. Um, and so we started running into some energy shortages because we were being a little too aggressive with the green transformation. And at the same time, of course, there is a need to be careful about how you displace workers in areas that depend on the production of fossil fuels like coal. And so one of the things, so what we see is China is really struggling to manage this transition, absolutely moving in the direction of achieving zero carbon goals, but having to be um, a little more cautious in terms of the speed in which it moves. So, for example, we have now the capacity to produce a lot more green energy than we use, and so now it's about how do we downsize in a responsible way our dependencies on the brown economy without creating too much job disruption or instability. And I can draw a parallel. I remember um, 6 or 7 years ago there was a major new innovation in logistics technologies. And a colleague of mine who studies that area said that in Shanghai, which is a major logistics hub, this new tech could have put around 70,000 people out of a job almost instantaneously. And what we saw is the government not allowing that um, technology to be deployed so quickly, but rather to slowly um, phase it in through time so that the disruptions could be managed in ways. So there is sort of this tension that takes place, but it's always trending in the right direction. And incidentally, we've seen this sustained even through the difficult recovery of from the pandemic and uh, over the past 2 years, having to clean up the property crisis, which is now largely resolved. It's no longer a crisis. It's still something that is lingering a little bit in terms of people wishing that their home values were what they were before, but we're no longer under that risk. But I'm saying even under those challenges, and even under the challenges imposed by the U.S. trade war, China did not backtrack on green development and green transformations, because the central leadership understands that among all the threats that China faces, climate change is probably number one. Now, I don't know if that's drifting a little off target in terms of our conversation, but in terms of rebranding, the extent to which other people around the world are aware of China moving up the value chain, I think people in Silicon Valley are very aware of it. I think Apple is very aware of it. I think countries that are trying to restrict TikTok or access to Chinese EVs, I think they're very aware of it. I think there's sort of a double-edged sword of the way the United States targeted Huawei, where they kind of present Huawei as this incredibly capable technology firm that can do whatever it wants. And while that may have induced fear in some countries, in countries that depend on access to Huawei products, they became rather happy to buy Huawei. Okay, that's the good stuff in that case, right? Um, and so we've seen, Huawei expanding its market share as well as specific products that it's developing for the global South, and it's in fact been recognized by the UN for helping to contribute substantially to closing the digital divide as developing countries try to move forward with this fourth industrial revolution. So I think that um, all of that's sort of a global perception. Internally, um, what what we're constantly reminded of is the need to embrace advanced quality productive forces, um, which would, in sort of Western speak, be consistent with moving up the value chain and establishing domestic technological solutions that are competitive the world over, um, and doing so in green ways. So all of that, I think, is something that has been moving forward. At the same time, one of the things that you often see in state media is referencing products like DeepSeek. And although DeepSeek is useful, there are, and Chinese people are very proud of DeepSeek and the way it was able to capture the global imagination. In fact, we have other AI products in China that many Chinese users, including my students and colleagues, consider to be superior, and also with free access. So there is this, I think, perception in China that China itself has made incredible breakthroughs in its own technological development, and and I think there's this perception internationally, but whether or not you see this as a positive thing or negative thing internationally, it probably depends on what industry you're in and which country's national strategy you support.
Thank you for this extensive answer. Yeah, you answered and covered quite some things that I want to just maybe dig a little bit more in the next questions. But I think I not purposefully use this word rebranding, which is probably not the right word, but I wanted to use that word because I think it's really about this, I guess, superficial external perception of this shift, really, from, as I said, this um, concept of made in China as, mostly a manufacturer for goods to a super technological power. And I think that somehow through the many things that you described, depending on which industry and which field of expertise you're in, this might come across in different ways. And I think this follows up with my next question, in which it seems also that for people who wouldn't be, let's say, too aware or too connected with the state of things and how they developed in China, there might be this Western narrative around how Chinese digital infrastructure and tech governance works a certain way, and it remains for the audience sometimes rather, let's say, distant, opaque, and sometimes it's just framed as bluntly authoritarian. And so I would like to just ask you, to what extent do you think that this narrative of what's currently going on in China, but represented or introduced by Western media, mainstream media, misrepresent the internal logic of China's technological agenda?
Sort of a special issue devoted to the subject of digital Orientalism, and this was a term that my friend had coined, and I had Max Meyer out of the University of Bonn, and I had my term was I took the term xenophobia and added techno in it. And although I think digital Orientalism has a more sort of poetic academic flair, I still think techno or phobia is the better word, um, both in terms of historical context and the fact that the term Orientalism now is considered taboo in China in academic circles, um, in so much as it's perceived as advancing sort of the victim narrative, which China wishes to avoid. That said, um, I think one of the things that's really sort of interesting about this perception of China as being authoritarian is, you know, when we talk about technology and we talk about technology companies in the West, what you have essentially now is a tech oligarchy, private enterprise. You know, we have people like Thiel who are um, playing very powerful roles in shaping U.S. governance. We have scholars in the United States, famous scholars, who argue the United States is no longer a democracy, but an oligarchy. And so at the same time, in the post 9/11 era, when we go back to the early days of the Patriot Act and all the subsequent legislation that followed, these are private companies that can um, collect information about private people. They can monetize that information in various ways with very little government or international oversight, and they have to provide the United States with access to that information um, in the name of national security. So that's that's the first point, and then the second point is if we understand how the United States actually works, And whether or not it's a democracy internally or not, let's say that's a separate question. But the United States doesn't actually work as a democracy in its international relations. And one could argue, and I think rather compellingly, that the way China operates in its international relations, as exemplified by its work with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, um, BRI, the various initiatives it's advanced through the United Nations, that China is a far more democratic country in terms of its foreign affairs, and certainly its commitments to multilateralism and a multipolar world, in contrast again to what we see coming from Washington. So um, when we when we talk about democracy versus authoritarian, we have to realize that we're already participating in an ideological debate that needs to be problematized and contested in terms of what I think people what their initial assumptions are. And then secondly, one of the things that we've seen in China is the Chinese government moving to limit um, Chinese tech firms from establishing oligarchic positions or even monopolistic positions in China itself. And from the Chinese perspective, this is consistent with democracy. It's consistent with ensuring that the state, which many people believe represents their interest, and indeed opinion surveys conducted by international organizations like Pew routinely find that Chinese people have a very, very high opinion of their central government, always exceeding 70%, sometimes in the high 80s. Um, Wherein, there is, I think, maybe a very different conception of um, of what democracy means and how democracy works. And indeed, a lot of the work that I've done in the past couple of years at the grassroots level, where we've seen um, actually new technologies, call centers, AI, empowering local people. Anyone can now pick up the phone and dial 12345 and immediately engage with government, register complaints, raise concerns, and it will create um, a um, flow through. It will create a ticket that will then be managed through the system, and then they use AI to assess all of this to help drive policymaking, to drive solutions to problems, and then this is aggregated, and then they share this with other districts, other cities, other regions. So I think all of these things are happening in ways, certainly under the rubric in China of what we call whole process people's democracy, which I think is a term that is generally rejected as sort of um, a fake democratic concept in the West. Um, I don't think that perception is widely held, um, and I do think that the vast majority of the 800 million people that China has raised out of poverty over the last couple of decades, um, they may have specific complaints about their local government or even their central government, but on the whole, they're rather confident that their government is moving in ways that reflect their own best interest. And I think if you look at the growing partnerships that China has created and the growing sense of security and peace that has prevailed in the wake of what China is accomplishing with its work in Central Asia, the Middle East, and now South Asia, and certainly Southeast Asia, that Chinese neighbors are also, most of them, not the ones that remain in security traps vis-a-vis the U.S., are feeling rather confident about China as a democratic player in global affairs. So that's where I think we have to take the conversation if we want to talk about questions about whether or not the Chinese system is itself opaque or authoritarian, and indeed whether or not its tech industry is also opaque or authoritarian. This is what, of course, we've heard these allegations made by Biden and his former Commerce Secretary, that Chinese EVs could be used as drones, that they could be taken over by the CPC, the ghost in the machine, who would then be able to attack, spy on Americans, and attack sensitive infrastructure. All of this is nonsense. We know that, for example, um, that these companies don't have that ability. We know that they wouldn't be able to, um, that they would have to do what was required of Tesla in China, which is Tesla had to make all of its digital um, functions run through Chinese servers in order to make sure that information was so. We've had Chinese companies observing very carefully the laws um, that have been placed upon them in whatever markets they've been operating in. And this is a requirement of Chinese law. In other words, if a Chinese firm is violating the law of another country, it can face sanction in China. So and there's a hyper awareness of the need to, if you want to advance and earn trust and not create fear, that you need to obey the local laws. Um, and so this is what has happened. Um, and yet these allegations still continue to be made in unfounded ways, because in the case of Biden, Biden was and then later Harris, they were trying to secure um, votes from the automotive workers, who were concerned that they were going to lose market share, and indeed they would lose market share to Chinese EVs. They're much cheaper, they're much more reliable, and um, and although American consumers don't get to have that advantage, in terms of the polarization that the Democrats faced with the Republicans, they needed to try to appeal to that vote. So you see that demonization taking place. But again, I think that all of this is built on a certain misunderstanding of the Chinese system and how China governs its own industries, and how those industries are required to make sure that they conform to laws and regulations elsewhere. And I think finally, on this point, we should recall that China has reached out many times to Europe, to the West, to try to advance international standards for AI governance and other tech related issues. And Silicon Valley, the Googles of the world, they don't want any of this. Um, and Europe has been, of course, I think, too suspicious, but also too hesitant to run contrary to the U.S. to advance that kind of development with China.
Thank you. No, this is why it's great to have you on the podcast, because I think this also sheds a lot of light and information on topics, or let's say more facts and different kind of revelations that you know of, and that perhaps most of the people who are listening to this podcast or general reading Western mainstream media wouldn't know of. So thank you so much. Moving on from the question of the perception and this technophobia and xenophobia, techno-xenophobia perhaps even, I would like to talk about somewhat the relationship with the aging population and the prospect of automation in China. So with this rapidly aging population, which undermined the labor-intensive model, how is China thinking of already using automation and AI to address labor shortages without marginalizing older or low-skilled workers? You mentioned previously about this technology, if I understood right, that could have been put in place, but that was somewhat stopped or regulated before it was actually implemented. And yeah, I would like to know more a little bit about how these things are, let's say, put in place so somewhat the economy can still thrive and at the same time not fully replace the main workforce.
Well, it's a good question, and I'd like to introduce a little thesis that I have. But before that, I have to make a couple of comments. The first is there is this tendency towards this idea that China is always beset with a crisis and always on the brink of collapse. And this sort of narrative is always being promoted in the West, and it's either an economic collapse or a political collapse or a moral collapse, and sometimes all three, depending on who you're listening to. I would remind people that during the era that we associate with the one-child policy, there were a lot of anti-China media around the world arguing that the big problem facing China was gender, um, um, the skewed gender ratios that essentially Chinese who were faced with a one-child policy were practicing some sort of sex selective abortion, and that we now had produced too many boys, and we were killing girls, and so forth and so on, and the humanity of this. And then what we began to find is, and this was really advanced by a friend of mine at University of Kansas, that when we look at the actual first grade enrollment data, um, the the gender issue doesn't disappear entirely, but it becomes significantly smaller. And the theory is that people were having a second child, but not registering that second child, not registering the birth. But then these children were showing up for first grade, and because local schools wanted to maximize enrollments, and because they had a moral obligation to educate children, they would find a way to get the kids into the system. So that this idea that Chinese are evil people who kill girls was something that was easily believed by a lot of people around the world, despite considerable evidence that was done by others, including scholars in Europe, that the one-child policy had probably done more to liberate women than any other state policy in human history. That aside, this discussion then moved into a different direction, which is that China had essentially cut its own throat by running the one-child policy as long as it did, that it had now made its population top-heavy, too many elderly people dependent on too few young people, and that this was going to be catastrophic, that it would be an unbearable burden, and above all, this was going to signal why a country like India which now has a higher population than China, would be the next China in terms of rapid development, and would thereby surpass China. And this intersected with various other narratives that China had in fact peaked and was already in a period of relative decline. I have in that respect, I have a thesis, because one of the things that I've learned, having worked with the Central Committee, having observed the CPC, having watched what they've done in terms of rural rejuvenation, recovering and protecting the environment, um, extending social welfare, helping to resolve issues related to gender equality. One of the things uh, that I have come to is the basic understanding that the Chinese government is not evil, that it doesn't aim to intentionally hurt or limit its people, but quite the opposite. And the second thing is that they're not stupid. Um, in other words, why did they why did they run the one-child policy as long as they did, even when there was, by some estimates, already registered concerns about whether or not they had taken it too far. And as I've thought about that question, but as someone who doesn't assume that they're evil or stupid, the thesis that I have developed but have not been able to test sufficiently, but I can kind of correlate it with some other things that I've seen in China, is that the primary concern that China faces right now, and indeed one of the primary concerns that most of the global South faces, are the cost and risk associated with climate change. And by many estimates, China is the country that is most vulnerable to climate change in terms of exposed populations and fixed capital investment. Um, Now, this leads to other questions about what sort of role do we see the United States and Russia playing, two global North countries that are dependent on fossil fuels? Are they playing a strategic end game with climate change as we see the rise of the global South? That's a separate conversation. But one of the things that if you understand Chinese politics, the first policy paper each year is devoted to agriculture and food security. And I suspect, given the fact that we're still losing arable land in China due to climate change, that the need to reduce the population is in fact related to two calculations. First, to reduce the burden associated with food security and making sure that we have enough food in the future. And second, because we are at the threshold of this fourth industrial revolution where we can begin to use technology in ways that make us less dependent on having a large population that can produce what the nation needs, or what the nation needs to become rich and more developed. So this is the first point. Then, as we move more directly to some of the other points in your question, I can tell you that I went to, this was 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I went to what was at that moment the most advanced um, factory line for EVs in China. At least that's how it was being explained to me by the engineers at this factory in Hefei, in Anhui province. And this factory line, they had 3 human workers on the line for an automobile. So I mean, so once it starts on the line and moves everything else was a symphony of robots, and massive robots. Robots that are like um, um, maybe 10 meters, 10 to 12 meters tall. That are picking up um, frames and moving heavy pieces, and doing so with a high degree of precision. So watching that line work, and at that time they were, the local technicians and engineers were bragging that it was much more advanced than the Gigafactory, the Tesla factory here in Shanghai. Um, so we're already seeing this taking place. We're already seeing um, the rapid advance of this type of production. But this, of course, these are new products. These are new, um, and so by creating these new jobs and creating these new products, you are employing workers as opposed to taking them away from other sectors. Now, in the case of the contradiction that I think you're trying to reach is what happens to workers be um, who will lose their jobs because of technology advances. But there's also another concern, is what happens to some workers because of technology advances, in so much as the jobs that they get. So, for example, in the gig economy, in China with the DD drivers um, and the delivery services. These are entirely powered by very, very sophisticated and effective AI. Um, and, I've been to several Marxist conferences in China where professors and others have raised difficult questions about the living and working conditions of people who are working in the gig economy. And this, in turn, is provoking the central government to respond with policies that aim to mitigate some of the challenges and problems associated with these new economic practices. Does it happen overnight? Um, no. Have we already seen a number of new regulations coming in to play that are aiming to curb excesses, to curb the negative sides? We're seeing that, and we still need to see more. But what I'm saying is those problems exist. They're being recognized and they're being dealt with because nobody likes them. Nobody likes those problems. I think we all like the fact that we can, for those of us who can order and have something delivered at our home within 30 minutes to an hour um, for a very small fee. Um, I think most of us are also sensitive to the fact that these workers need to have better opportunities and more insecure employment so that they can achieve and the level of development they want. But also, I think we all realize that following out the economy and having a large group of workers under desperate conditions is a risk for all of us, not just a moral hazard or an injustice, but something that compromises the security and well-being of all society. So we are seeing efforts to mitigate some of those factors. In terms of one of the things that I'm concerned about with the rapid adoption of technology, and this is something that I discuss with one of the senior fellows that I hired into my center, who's one of the leading scientists with Lenovo here in Shanghai, is what are the costs, what are the environmental costs, the ecological costs associated with the rapid adoption of new technologies. So, for example, we know that when we jumped from 4G to 5G, that this corresponded with an exponential increase in data transfers. That also requires an exponential increase in energy usage. I know from my visits to the laboratories at Huawei, and this was in 2019 when I went there, and they told me they already have all the tech necessary for 6G, but it takes time to stage, to build up the infrastructure, because the higher you go, 4, 5, 6, the more um, physical infrastructure you need in order to push those waves through walls, and it takes time to scale up. But essentially, the technology exists. It just takes time to build it and to finance it up. But once it does go active, you will again see an exponential increase in energy usage. At the same time, a lot of the applications that are running on our devices and that will be, accounting for much of those data transfers will be AI. And we know that there's a tremendous amount of energy used by AI, and certainly heat and other things generated. So this is where we see Lenovo, to this one guy in particular that I'm working with, where he's invented um, several products that can capture the heat generated by the AI servers and convert that to energy that feeds back into those same servers in order to, and then you can at the same time power those servers with green energy to ensure that they are ultimately carbon neutral. And this is distinct from the message that we're hearing from companies like Google, who say that only companies like Google have the capacity to produce AI services in a zero carbon or green way. And again, this is trying to consolidate and advance monopolistic practices, which ultimately, from the Chinese perspective, for those of us who understand the value of living behind the Great Firewall, China doesn't end up being a data colony. Chinese people aren't ultimately subject to the sort of intrusive behaviors and monetization of their private information, or the sort of propaganda that these firms promote. Um, but a lot of other countries are, including Europe, India, you know, um, Japan. All of them are increasingly at the mercy of these large Western firms um, that play a very big role in controlling the information that they are able to get, and then taking all the information they want. So um, so there are, I think, a lot of questions as we step through this transition. Um, and I think this is one of the things we study in the Singularity Institute we have here. We would recognize AI as a singularity event. We would recognize climate change as a singularity event, and we would recognize quantum computing as the next big singularity event. And then we would, of course, be worried about how all these singularities are intersecting. Um, so we know that Google, for example, has predicted what they call Q Day for some time in 2030. And if the experts are correct, then Q Day will be much more transformative, if not disruptive, than AI. We know, for example, that a lot of countries right now and a lot of criminal organizations are hacking and storing encrypted data. And when Q Day arrives, they will break all of those encryptions and harvest that data in ways that could create tremendous havoc in international financial markets, security, so forth and so on. So there are these sort of risks on the horizon, but of course, with quantum computing, you will have even higher energy usage rates and even more. So I think there are some outstanding questions right now about whether or not technology is outpacing green energy development. Um, I think that's absolutely the case in countries that aren't aggressively pursuing green development and green transformation. But I think we have a better chance in China, um, um, which is prioritizing these changes for finding a better balance, at least.
Thank you. Thank you for answering this. This kind of was covering also some of the follow-up questions. So I would like to perhaps go a little bit in another direction, and that's also the last question I will have for you today. But this is something that particularly interested me during the class you gave on Marxism with Chinese characteristics. Somewhat your lecture and your insights and the information you provided right now give a hint that a certain political agenda and ideology implies a different set of regulation and a different set of protection for society. And I wonder then, as automation accelerates and employment structure shifts, what mechanism does a socialist state like China have to maintain social stability, specifically regarding welfare redistribution and large-scale labor displacement? I'm asking this, it kind of goes back to some of the things you mentioned, but it's because I do really see how little in the West the states can have a hold on what's going on in terms of regulation, ethics, welfare as well, or let's say social security when it comes to mass unemployment that could emerge from AI, or just in general how this is shifting the, let's say, economical market, job market. And I'm not so sure, I'm not seeing drastic yet ways to cope with that change. And throughout your lecture and your presentation, I got a sense that the way in which China still have some kind of a hold on what's being produced and how it's being used. Therefore, I would like, if it's possible, for you to expand a little bit more on how this political agenda regulates or tolerates technological development.
Well, let's begin with sort of contesting, I think, another misconception, a popular misconception about China, which is that the party, the CPC, is a monolith that controls everything, and not only that, it's a monolith under the control of one man, and that and so this creates, I think, a certain type of fear. It also creates, in the West, it also creates a sense of malign conspiracy, but also, strangely enough, there are moments when, it creates this inflated sense of power that China can do whatever it wants. There's this perception in Europe, for example, that the president of China could pick up the phone and call the president of Russia and end the conflict immediately in Ukraine, and that's simply not true. Or that the president, by hook or by crook, controls what all of us think in China. The fact of the matter is the CPC is the largest political party in the world, and it has the responsibility of trying to represent everyone. And this means literally everyone, but it also means the fact that there are very different parts of China, very different regions, very different ethnic groups, very different levels of development, very different economic models. And it has to mediate all of those conflicts. One of the ways that we should understand the party is the extent to which it is engaged in perpetual mediation of differences in order to try to maximize as much social harmony as possible, while at the same time continuing to advance, given the fact that the Chinese want to advance for two reasons. First, because they have some sort of commitment to this modernist teleology that says that, okay, things will get better the more advanced we become, but also because if they don't advance, then they will face existential risks associated with the United States or climate change or whatever else is coming down the pike. So that's the first point. The second is, nevertheless, the capacity that the country has, and I would say I have another thesis. I gave you a thesis earlier about the one-child policy. I have the second thesis, which is what is particularly effective in the CPC, and where the CPC often works the best, where all of its elements come together and really begin to function and sync, is when the country is faced with a crisis. And this is when people mobilize, and so much so that I would suggest that the party often needs a crisis in order to actualize its potential. And when it doesn't have one, it starts to become inefficient and begins to struggle with factionalism and disputes, internal disputes. So actually, the worst thing that the U.S. could have done is to threaten China with a technology blockade. It mobilizes every aspect of China to now solve that problem. And by the way, they're solving that problem in ways that are going to end up backfiring. Um, and um, and it's really going to be a strategic mistake on the U.S. because in the past the U.S. could use China's dependence on foreign technology to, have a sort of a point of leverage, and China in the future will no longer be subject to that leverage, but instead will have um, products that can outcompete those in the U.S. So so we can then again look back to things, events like the pandemic, which I witnessed. I got stuck in the United States for 2 years during COVID, but then came back in 2021 to China and then witnessed firsthand all of the solutions that they had put in place. I was traveling a lot with Shenhua doing documentaries. I got to see how they were handling it in Hunan versus Anhui versus Guangdong um, versus Gansu. So very different parts of the country and very different capabilities. And by the way, all of these were managed locally according to local capabilities. Um, and But under national guidance, but through local capacities. So the way that China can bring itself together and address these types of problems, whether they are you know simple questions like how do we um, continue to move forward and address things like climate change and the need for zero carbon versus how do we respond to an emergent crisis like COVID-19. So um, these things these things are part and parcel with where China does well. Now, I will say that one of the things that this will help illustrate, I think, the part of the question you've raised. There was for a long time this question in China about what was the role of the private sector versus the public sector, and which direction would the government go? And for a long time, the assumption was that China needed to continue to limit the public sector, to curtail the state-owned enterprises, and to give more play to the private enterprises. And what we have found, given the headwinds associated with the pandemic, but also the US trade war, is that the party has decided that China needs both elements. It needs the private, and especially the private's capacity to accelerate technological innovations. But it also depends fundamentally on the state-owned enterprises, where they can sustain employment during periods of crisis. They can deliver public goods, um, uh, and um, and even as we saw in the wake of the global financial crisis in 2008, um, you can, for example, push state-owned banks to give loans to state-owned enterprises, and in this way pump money into the economy to avoid financial collapse. And you have that creates a problem you have to clean up later, but it helps you maintain employment, maintain social stability and social well-being. So we've seen China using these approaches. At the same time, we've also seen China, um, the way China will intervene sometimes in the market, in the stock market. So there are triggers that will shut the market down if something sort of spirals out of control. And then China is able to use two methods to return stability to the market. It can um, order the trading firms that it owns to make buys that will prop up the market. So then you can find the root cause and then address the root cause. But also through other policies that we call macro controls, make market interventions that will stop the contagion and reestablish order in a broader sense. Um, so we've seen this uh, done when necessary to prevent things from spiraling out of control, whether it's the need for a rapid market intervention or whether it's something like responding to a crisis like COVID. Now, of course, we do end up with inefficiencies. We do end up with sometimes state-owned enterprises carrying too much employment, um, and sometimes we end up with um, local governments providing incentives that lead to the formation of too many companies trying to get into the EV market or solar panel market, and then we run into problems where we have to clean those inefficiencies up. But um, but nevertheless, these are things that I can give you another example. The property market, the way China has cleaned up the property market. First, it addressed the fundamental political reason why we had a problem from the beginning, and then secondly, um, it 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 began to place restrictions that prevented that problem from returning. And then thirdly, it began to clean up the firms that were no longer able to behave responsibly in the marketplace, um, um, and doing so in ways that China can do, with especially with state-owned firms or firms that are bankrupt and now need um, to go into some form of receivership with the government. So, we see China having unique policy solutions like being able to sell the most valuable properties in these firms that are going under, and then develop some of the others for low-income housing, and then giving the third, the less desirable, to state-owned enterprises, who then have a social responsibility to find the best way to deal with those properties um, for their own ledgers, but also the greater good of society. So, if this had happened in the United States or what have you, like if you saw what happened in the wake of '08, what you had was a lot of people who lost their jobs and lost their homes and lost their access to healthcare. And, at the same time, this intersected with the opioid crisis, which was caused by the pharmaceutical industry and poor regulation, which leads to the fentanyl problem and this downward spiral that we've seen that ends up, contributing to right-wing politics that of the sort that we've seen dominating the U.S. in recent years. So all of those things are precisely where we saw the spiraling out of control related to a financial crisis that was caused by poor governance. And here, what we had was an issue related to poor governance, related specifically to the economic entrenchment of the third generation of Chinese leadership that was left to the fifth generation to rectify, and that's what's happened. So I think that I think that when we look at various problems like the transition to automated labor and or other new economic models that de-emphasize labor-intensive production, as we look. So, for example, one of the interesting things in Beijing, and it's not just happening in Beijing, but I was involved in a project that was looking at this. They're building. Um, I can't remember off the top of my head, but hundreds of cafeterias in neighborhoods that where old people live, and they're going in and making sure that those apartment buildings have elevators, and that they have a local cafeteria which is wheelchair accessible, so that old people can come and have a healthy, nutritious meal at a subsidized price. And there'll be other services, point of services there, if people need to get their blood pressure checked or something like this. So we already see the state, moving to ensure that that people are cared for, and at the same time, we also see young people being incentivized to start firms that provide services that elderly people need, elderly people who have high rates of savings and money. So I think that when we look at problems like this, even when we look at problems like climate change, the Chinese system as an advanced technological society, as a system that is especially capable of confronting and dealing with crises, that it's better positioned than anyone else to solve the various problems that you've highlighted in some of your questions.
Thank you, Joseph. It's been a lot of information. This was my last question. So I think to conclude this interview, I would like to maybe ask you if you have like a few other things you would like to mention, or sources or ways to get to know more about this topic, either through book, podcasts, or anything, because in case the listeners or whomever would come across this episode would be curious to know more, if you have any platforms, media, or anything to share, that would be very welcome.
Well, I would say that if you are looking for information, like high-level information from China itself, one of the more reliable platforms is the journal published by the Central Committee. There's an English version. It's called Qiushi, Qiushi. And there you will see all the speeches and directives from the central government being published and discussed. It's a little dry, but that's the nature of governance. I think for people who are interested in following what I say and talk about, they can follow me on LinkedIn. I'm just there under my full name, Joseph Gregory Mahoney, Josef Gregory Mahoney, and I do a lot of work with the state, a lot of research, a lot of discussion, and so if they want to see where my thinking is on something, but I've also joined a lot of other podcasts. They can search me on YouTube and other places where I discuss more the history and the development. I did a long podcast a couple of days ago that has been published with Daniel Tutt, where we talk about the unique aspects of Chinese thinking and how that relates to Chinese governance. So I don't want to make myself the sole point of reference, but I'm saying if people want to sort of follow those conversations, I talk about related topics in other fora. As for if you really want to know something about China, I would suggest that you should come to China. And I know that not everyone is positioned to do that, maybe financially or due to other reasons. But we do have programs in China. We do have graduate programs in my school, for example, the program I run, but there are many others in other universities that are taught in English that offer generous scholarships. Come here, do a master's degree, see for yourself, or just come here on an extended vacation. A lot of people have visa-free arrivals now. I think if you spend some time in cities like Shanghai, you will be shocked, I think. I travel extensively in Europe and throughout Asia. I don't know another city that is more developed than Shanghai. I think we could say that Seoul is comparable in some respects, but not more advanced. Hong Kong, which a city I dearly love, not as advanced. Taipei, certainly much further behind. Tokyo, even Japan has fallen mightily. It's no longer in the top 10 internationally in terms of tech innovation and development. So I think there's so much misinformation about China, and people would have their reasons for not trusting what I have to say. Um, so come see for yourself, and you should come see for yourself, because I honestly believe um, that China is not only a big part of the world, but that China continuing to make progress is essential for peace and human security on a global scale. And the extent to which other people can realize this and at least not oppose it, but even better, if they could find some way to encourage it and support it, then the greater chance we will all have for surviving the challenges that come, and above all, the challenges that will face our children and theirs.
Thank you so much, Joseph, and thank you everyone for listening to Becoming the Product. I see you at the next episode.